Hello and welcome to the premiere episode of Kenya Through the Times. I am your host Franklin Brata, and today we shall be discussing the Lancaster House Conferences. So if none of you are familiar with this building, this is the Lancaster House in the UK where your independence as a Kenyan was discussed. And the conference, there were 3 conferences in total. The first Lancaster House Conference in 1960, second one in 1962, and the final one in 1963. So today we shall be breaking down all 3 conferences and the consequences of each one. The purpose of the first Lancaster House Conference was to negotiate constitutional reforms which allowed Africans to participate in governance and self-rule. So the first Lancaster Conferences was attended by leaders from KANU like Tom Mboya, Oginga Odinga and James Gishuru, leaders from KADU as well, Kenya African Democratic Union, Ronald Ngala, Daniel Moi and Masinde Muliro. If you've noticed, I've not mentioned Kenyatta in attendance. This is because at the time, Jomo Kenyatta was still detained at Lodwar, and he would later on be released in 1961. And thus he attended the other 2 Lancaster House Conferences. So when meeting in the first Lancaster House, they came to a number of decisions. One of them was Africans ended up gaining majority seats in the Legislative Council. That was the parliament at the time. This was seen as a good step towards achieving internal self-rule at some point. Because remember, at this point, the UK still controlled most of Kenya's major sectors, such as defense, the foreign affairs of the country, and they still maintained rule over the state of Kenya. But another thing that was discussed was the reforms that should be made considering the grievances of the Mau Mau uprising. Remember, Kenya was still just come out of a state of emergency, meaning that it had just gone through a very rough time politically, and they needed a way to peacefully resolve the grievances addressed by the Mau Mau during the state of emergency. And another concern was concerned by the Europeans and the Asians, who felt that they still needed their political and economic interests protected. Even as the Kenya would move towards independence, they still needed that assurance that they are safe and their economic interests will be catered for by the independent government. And now we shall be moving on to the second Lancaster House Conference. So yes, the second Lancaster Conference was held in order to settle on the system of government that would be used by Kenya. The 2 main parties, the Kenya African National Union, KANU, led by Jomo Kenyatta, and the Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU, led by Ronald Ngala, they had opposing ideologies. KANU believed that Kenya should have a strong unitary government, in which all power to allocate, all the powers and the ability to allocate resources were a responsibility of the of the central government, and then KADU believed in a federal government, in which each region had the power to allocate its own key resources and to rule within themselves. They refer to this system as Majimboism. Majimbo is a Swahili word meaning regions, and so you can connect the 2. So now, during this meeting, these ideologies were formed based on the fact that KANU was composed of the major tribes, this being the Kikuyu and the Luo. They were the strongest tribes politically, and thus KADU was made in order to protect the interests of the minority tribes, the Kalenjin, the Maasai, coastal communities, and basically any tribe that want either Kikuyu or Luo. That's why KADU advocated for a Majimbo government in order to ensure that the interests of minorities are protected. During the second Lancaster House Conference, an agreement was made for the federal government, the Majimboism. This was made in order to protect the minority communities. This was supposed to be the system followed by the government as they approached independence. Remember, the second Lancaster House Conference happened in 1962, and we achieved independence a year later, 1963. And that's also when the third and final Lancaster House Conference happened. Now, the third and final Lancaster House Conference, this was where the Independence Constitution was drafted. And another thing, and so remember, in the second Lancaster conference, they agreed on federalism. Well, in this one, there was a change. As they were drafting the independent constitution, they came to the decision that they would much rather have a unitary government. This was because KANU was the majority party at the time and was destined to be the ruling party, and they felt that a strong central system was much more efficient, and Majimboism had not really been that impactful. You'd find that some communities and regions with lesser resources they weren't really doing that well. So they ended up deciding, you know what, let's just move for the unitary government. And so yes, this is where they drafted the independence constitution, and this was where the independence timetable was agreed upon. This is where you hear things like internal self-rule 1st June, Madaraka Day, and then Independence Day was on 12th December 1963, and then Kenya became a republic on 12th December 1964. That is now the that's the independence calendar they're talking about, the independence timetable, if you will. So yeah, there's another agreement was that Jomo Kenyatta would become the new prime minister of the independent Kenya, and Kenya would also remain as a Commonwealth state despite being independent. Kenya is a Commonwealth state to date, and that is how they finally agreed upon the ending of 70 years of colonial rule in Kenya. My name is Franklin Brata, and thank you again. Join us next time here on Kenya Through the Time.